Oi, oi! It's the Sungwoo Choi of being your boy, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you on Monday, the 14th of November, following UFC 281. I put out a tweet shortly before this event happened saying, quietly optimistic about UFC 281. And then it turned out to be really good, or solidly good. It was no UFC 217 or Pride Bushido 9, but what is? It was, however, very solid. Lots of exciting stuff happened, lots of exciting stuff to talk about, some cool technical stuff, a couple of things to moan about, which, it wouldn't be right if I didn't have a little moan about something. Had some meme fights, meme finishes, and it's just a really lovely night of fights to have before you get your Derek Lewis main event next week. I suppose we best lead with the main event, because that was the thing I'd done tons of work on in the weeks up to this, months up to this, actually. A couple of months ago, I released Advanced Striking 2.0 Alex Pereira, which you should now definitely read if you haven't read it. And a couple of days before the fight, I released Advanced Striking 2.0 Israel Adesanya. Both of those available to Patreon boys. They're extended studies full of illustrations. They got an audio track if you don't like reading, so you can just listen to it and look at the pictures. And they just go really in depth on what both fighters do, what makes both fighters special. If you miss me writing shit and laying stuff all out respectfully without any banter in between, the articles are for you. We'll get into some technical stuff here, but I will also be bantering. I was explaining how my job had changed to a friend the other day. I say I used to have a rule that I never wrote anything I wouldn't want a fighter's mother to read about them. And then I started doing a podcast, and now people just love me calling fighters bums all the time. It's just such a different medium. But anyway, main event, Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya. Really good fun, technical scrap. Some of the more interesting stuff that we've seen from Izzy lately, even before, I'm not saying that because he lost, I'm saying that because he really got to work, hurting Pereira a couple of times in the run-up to the fifth round finish. I've got to say, fifth round knockout for Pereira was one of my least likely outcomes, I think, because historically Pereira has been such a front runner. He comes out, certainly in kickboxing at least, he used to come out, and again, we're very short on MMA footage of him. And, there's not an awful lot to go on of him in MMA. Sip of tea, another T2 today. I think it's French Earl Grey, which I found out doesn't contain bergamot, and that seems like not really Earl Grey at all then. But yes, fifth round knockout by Pereira was probably my least likely outcome, because Pereira has faded in later rounds in a lot of his fights. And though, as we said before, he's not had to grapple anyone particularly lengthily. His first UFC fight, he got held against the fence for the first round, and then just came out and threw the flying knee in sort of I hope that doesn't happen again sort of way. So we didn't really get to see him over the distance with grappling involved. And of course, kickboxing matches are so much shorter. We said that on the last episode, but a kickboxing title match, a glory title match, is 5 3-minute rounds. A UFC title match is 5 5-minute rounds. 3 minutes, 5 minutes doesn't sound like that much, but then realize you're doing almost double the work in fight time. And the breaks between rounds stay exactly the same. Add to that we talked about this last week, but with Adesanya in the kickboxing matches and with Yusri Belgawi, two guys who gave him a lot of trouble, he didn't seem to have worked out how to stop them giving him trouble. He just hit him really hard one time and knocked him out. The Belgawi ones are really unfortunate, because Belgawi does great in... Belgawi beats him in the first fight, does great in the second fight until he gets hit with a good right hand, and that's him done. And then does great in the third fight, but it's only 2 minutes before he gets caught with a big right hand. It was never that Pereira could stop these guys doing what made them difficult for him. It's just that he has this amazing eye for an opening and really sells out when he goes for it. And it kind of was that in this one too. I mean, he was landing some good shots throughout the fight, obviously, but he just got his mark in the fifth round, and he made it all count. It was very, very impressive. Now, we talked at length about how he had probably the greatest left hook in kickboxing history. I put that out when I put the Advanced Striking 2.0 article out. I said let's have a look at the greatest left hook in kickboxing history. And someone was like, oh, everything's the greatest in history now. And I was just like, name a better one. I agree, people do get over the top with the greatest in X, greatest in Y, but there really hasn't been a better left hook in kickboxing than Alex Pereira's. It's absolutely remarkable. But let's go from the top, because firstly, could not get over how much bigger Pereira looked than Adesanya in the early, well, throughout the fight. But I think it was probably exaggerated by him standing so tall. In kickboxing, Adesanya would go through between like a high stance and a lower stance. In MMA, he's tended to fight from sort of a longer, lower stance. But yeah, Pereira seemed to be towering over him at all times. Pereira tried to pressure him and put him against the cage. Adesanya tried to circle. Honestly, I thought his circling along the cage didn't look as comfortable as usual. Even in the first and second round, he got caught with good left hooks along the fence, when normally you watch guys, if they corner him at all, if they catch him against the fence at all, he goes one way, circles back the other, they throw a big swing and he ducks under it. Or he circles out again in the other direction. He's very good at direction changing and reading people as they come in on him. But that Pereira left hook is so tight that even early on, he got caught with a couple of them just along the fence. But what you saw in this one was like a lot of hand fighting. And this was something I didn't really talk about much or consider much coming into this match. Was we talked about how Adesanya was very handsy, and that was what gave Pereira so much trouble in their two kickboxing matches. Pereira throws punches and then gets down behind his shoulders, kind of like a boxer, which is not very usual in kickboxing, where everyone just puts on the earmuffs most of the time, Robin van Roosmalen style. But Adesanya, he does a lot of leverage guarding and framing, putting his straight arms on people's shoulders or over their shoulders and keeping his shoulders up to protect his own chin. He uses his hands on his opponents a lot, even with big gloves on. Now, with small gloves on, it meant that he could actually grab Pereira's wrists, which really did seem to annoy Pereira throughout most of this fight, actually. Anytime Pereira got him towards the fence, Izzy would just reach out and grab a hold of his left hand, which is obviously most of the danger. And it annoyed Pereira so much that there's a bit in the third round where Izzy grabs him around the wrist, and Pereira gets his other hand, his right hand, comes across, grabs Izzy's wrist and pulls it off to free his hand, which is, in a striking context, a bit suicidal, because you have to... Your right hand is covering your right side of your body and your head, and your left hand is covering your left side of your body and your head. When you reach across yourself, you are opening yourself up to what was, Izzy's right hand. He'd already hurt him with a couple of right hands already. But that's how much the hand fighting was annoying him, that he just went, fuck it, grabbed the hand off, and then went back to his stance. We were weighing up the prospect of Adesanya grappling in this one, and it's very weird because there were stats coming out all week that he'd never tried to take anyone down in the UFC. Against Gastelum, and I think against Brunson, against a couple of guys, he has hit like a Sasai Surukomiyashi, a step aside and sweep, the Thai-style dump, and thrown them to the floor and got on top of them. Certainly against Gastelum he did. That's got to count as a takedown, you'd think, but it wasn't showing up in the stats that I was being shown in graphs and things on Twitter and Reddit. But yes, he's not unwilling to take people down, so I was interested to see what he did here regarding that. And also, Alex Pereira has had some trouble with the clinch in the past because he is pure kickboxing. He never really had a Muay Thai career. A lot of guys in kickboxing have done Muay Thai and they switch back and forth between them. The guy that he won the belt off in Glory, Simon Marcus, famous for his clinch. But the money was in the kickboxing, so he stopped doing it. He came to kickboxing and had to fight without one of his main weapons. And they started to allow like a bit more clinch work. They let you work, like as long as you were throwing knees, they'd let you work a bit more before breaking you. And that was the case in the rematch between Marcus and, or actually in both matches between Marcus and Pereira. And Pereira, in the second match, he starts putting his own knee across himself in a position that, like, if you did it in MMA or Muay Thai, the guy would just throw you because you're so off balance. But he could do it in kickboxing because there were no throws. Throws are illegal. The only thing Marcus could do was knee, and if he put if Pereira put his own knee across in front of both of them, neither of Marcus's knees were hitting anything good. Again, this is all in the Advanced Striking 2.0, but like he'd had some trouble with the clinch. Vakatov had some good success landing some knees against him. Vakatov, a much shorter guy, despite being the champion in the weight class above. Pereira's weight is going to be a point of fascination for a while, I think, because he looks exactly the same when he weighs 205 pounds as when he weighs 185 pounds. In Glory, like, he didn't seem to change at all. He's just always bigger than whoever he fights, always. Except Yusri Belgawi. But anyway, we're talking about grappling. I was interested to see if Izzy attempted any of it, and it seemed like what he did was if he got cornered along the fence, he would first, as a first means of defense, check Pereira's hands and fight from there, strike from there, and try and move off the fence. And if Pereira got too close, he'd tie him up and threaten to take him down. What I noticed in the first first 2 and a bit rounds, was that Adesanya would tie up, and it seemed like he was having, it seemed like Pereira was physically stronger, maybe not as technical in the clinch, but Adesanya would be tying him up and trying to like jack up an underhook and stuff, and Pereira would be kneeing and punching, and Adesanya wouldn't really be doing anything. But as the fight progressed, Adesanya was able to use takedowns and get Pereira to the mat, get on his back. There were bits where it was quite clear that Pereira is still in sort of like the infancy of learning how to get up and stuff. Izzy was behind him in the turtle and holding his wrists, and Pereira's just trying to get up. But every time he like starts to stand up, he goes, "Oh, why can't I stand up?" "Oh, because you need your hands. You need to free your hands." I mean, DC was going mental about it on commentary, but he's working with Glover Teixeira. He's been working on it for a long while. Glover Teixeira obviously very good at grinding people and taking them down, so he'll be learning it. But it's just he seemed quite stumped by simple stuff in parts of this fight. Went confidently for his own takedowns, but like he went for an Osotogari, an outside reap, step through and kick out the opponent's leg. And it's a crazy one because if you don't get it right, like the other guy can just throw you to your back because again, you're like committing a cross yourself. And that's what Adesanya did. He just took a body lock and threw him all the way over. But in that constant sort of hand fighting before the clinch played out in the striking as well, because if you watched Adesanya kept catching him with this 1-2 that was like 1, and then there was a big pause before the 2. And if you watch the replays, it's because he's jabbing, and then he's throwing his hand up over Pereira's lead shoulder and pulling down to try and take out the left hand before he throws his right straight. And Pereira kept dropping his left hand to try and stop it getting trapped. And it played out the same. It just meant that the path to his jaw was free. And that was the one that Izzy hurt him with in the first round, but landed it throughout the fight. But in the 5th round, Pereira comes forward, manages to time the left hook along the fence. He landed a couple of really good jabs along the fence and a couple of really good left hooks along the fence in the fight up to that point. But he landed a perfect one in round 5 that hurt Izzy. Swarmed on him. Originally, when I saw it, I went, "Oh, not sure I like that stoppage," and I tweeted that. And then I saw the replay and I went, "Actually, that stoppage was fine." So I should not commit to my stance on stoppages so soon after watching an intense match. But yes, he was moving his head, but like he'd been hit a lot, and he wasn't looking at the punches. His head was down, and it's one of those things where it's kind of like Lesnar versus Carwin, where I think a lot of fights generally, if you let them go on, there's a good chance the other guy would get back into it because the guy who was winning it would get tired. It's just, is it worth letting them have that punishment? And do you have a different standard for title fights? Because you shouldn't. It's you should have the same standard for everything. The standard to win should be the same. But stoppages like this one where you're like, I feel like he probably had a good chance. There's a 50-50 chance of whether he got smoked violently if that fight had been allowed to go a little longer, or if he grabbed a hold of Pereira or Pereira slowed down a bit and then he got to the finish, and then that would have been probably, I think he was winning on the cards at the time. So there's always that sort of like, what if this, that and the other. Adesanya and his team don't seem too upset about the stoppage. And of course, it sets the stage for another rematch because Adesanya has had no trouble with anyone else in this division except the second time against Robert Whittaker. So chances of him winning his way to another title fight are pretty good, even if he has to take a break between now and then. Even if he has to take a couple of fights between that, doesn't get an immediate rematch. Khamzat Chimaev is already being like, I want to fight for the middleweight title. Because we talked about this before, but it's such a weird situation. Such an untested grappler achieving what he has at this point because the champion was such a specialist. Adesanya was the best takedown artist he'd fought. How crazy is that? Or as someone on the top comment of the Reddit thread said, the champion can't defend a wrist lock, which I thought was fucking hilarious. But yeah, I mean, it absolutely paid off or lived up to my expectations. It wasn't an all-out barn burner, but it was an exciting scrap. It was technical. There was a lot going on. Even when there wasn't a lot going on, there was stuff playing out, which the matchup of the hand fighting and the wrestling and so on. And it had a big come from behind victory, which is always exciting. Right, next I think we should talk about the one that everyone was already excited about and knew would probably be a banger. Michael Chandler versus Dustin Poirier. Bloody exciting fight. I mean, if you've not watched it, if there's one thing you need to watch from this card, it's probably that. I think Michael Chandler is in an interesting spot. I think he recognizes that he's not one of the best lightweights in the world skill-wise. He has some glaring holes in his game. He's a very limited fighter. But I think he can knock out most of the best lightweights. Well, I think he can knock out just about any lightweight in the world if he catches them. There's like a 50-50 on that, because if they can recover and he's not able to finish, he's not a terrific systematic finisher. He really is like, he'll hit you with a really hard punch and hopefully you go out cold immediately, or you fall into some position where your hand's trapped under you and he can just hit you like 3 more times and get the stoppage. He's not great at capitalizing on people being hurt. But he's super, super dangerous, but very, very limited. Dustin Poirier is very hittable some of the time, and then other times he's not. Dustin Poirier has been a fascination of mine, and again, I'm going to plug another Advanced Striking 2.0 article, because this is the first event where we've had 3 people with Advanced Striking 2.0 studies out on them. But Dustin Poirier, I did a little while ago. I did 3 Filthy Casuals guides on him. He's a very interesting character, because he's done it his own way. He's gone his own way. You can go your own way. No, but he's... a lot of stuff he does is not good boxing, but then he's added a lot of elements that are principally good boxing to his game. This is something we talked about in the Adesanya one as well, but like principles versus appearances. It doesn't always look like stuff out of a textbook, but principally, it's good. Getting down behind your elbows, getting down behind your shoulders, putting big bony structures between in the path of the opponent's punches, not relying on hiding behind your gloves, which are tiny in MMA, so you can't really do it anyway. Huge part of what made Dustin Poirier successful, he used to have the double left hand shift through right hand, which was his move. That used to be all he did. If you watch his fight with Carlos Diego Ferreira when they're both young featherweights, they both fight like absolute shit. And I think that was after the McGregor fight, the first one. What happened was that at some point, Dustin Poirier stopped running across the ring and then running backwards on defense, and learned to stand in front of people. And that's such a great strength to have in MMA, because so many people there aren't an awful lot of ways to defend yourself from straight in front of someone in MMA. You really need to learn to use your eyes, use your shoulders and your elbows, and frame on them. And that's what makes people like Israel Adesanya and Anderson Silva back in the day very special, is that they could comfortably stand in front of an opponent, which you can't really do if you've learned to hide behind your gloves. And especially in MMA, where everyone thinks that like you go forward when you're attacking and then you retreat when they're attacking. So you're never really in position to counter unless the guy really overextends. But by learning to shoulder roll and get down behind his elbows and shoulders, Dustin Poirier managed to... Well, the shoulder roll generally is a platform for counter offense. It lets you stand in the firing line, so you know you're close enough when you throw your punches. Super extreme example, but go and watch Charlie Zelenov versus Floyd Mayweather Sr. 60-year-old man, young dude with very, very sloppy form, but punching as hard as he can very wide. And Mayweather can just stand in front of him, take the punches on his shoulders, and throw back punches knowing that he'll hit freely. But yes, there was this was really like Michael Chandler's speed and explosivity versus Dustin Poirier's durability and technique over the time. Because, I want to say technique wins out over explosivity and power, but there's a sweet spot, because technique also gives out to conditioning and grit after a certain amount of time. But if you watch this fight, I slowed down a couple of bits. Michael Chandler, I was watching a few guys try and reinvent him as a very technical fighter in the week, and I was going, I'm not sure he is. He basically just throws a lunging right hand to the body 3 or 4 times, and then to the head. And then sometimes he'll shift through with the left hand afterwards. But if you ever slow him down, his hands are down by his waist, his shoulders are far forward from his hips, he's falling into whatever he's doing. And I think Poirier said himself after this, if he threw some straight punches, he might have got me. But he doesn't really hook, he just throws long looping blows. And there were a lot of moments in this fight where Chandler swings a big right hand. Poirier, who has a very good jab, hits him with a southpaw jab and stumbles him. It happens about 4 times in this fight. But there's a clip that I put on Twitter, just slowed down. It's Chandler shifting in 4 times, swinging wild, with his head way out in front of him, just missing every time. And Dustin Poirier going straight back on a straight line, which is also bad. That's always been one of Poirier's weaknesses, going straight back, footwork-wise. He's learned to look after himself and counter and stuff from in front of the person. But it's why, 2 things really played into him losing to Khabib badly. One was that he puts himself on the fence by retreating from people, which he did within like 30 seconds of the Khabib fight on the feet. And the second is that he uses the fence to get up really well, but that is also just putting you where Khabib wants you, basically. You're stuck against the fence. And this is quite interesting because in this week, Islam Makhachev said he was being interviewed by DC and he was trashing Dustin's jiu-jitsu. And there's elements of Dustin's jiu-jitsu that aren't super elite, obviously. And, Islam Makhachev, obviously, god-tier grappler. But people lose sight of the fact that styles do make fights. It has to be that Dustin's not a good grappler. And I'm looking at it going, no, Dustin's a very good grappler in MMA. Especially because, if you watch him get stuck underneath Chandler in this one, Chandler's whole game, I've talked about it for years, but when he gets tired, takes the dude down, sits in closed guard, hits him with elbows. And he ended up in half guard against Poirier in the second round, I think. Poirier sits up onto his hands and immediately scoots his butt back to the fence, and then he's up within 15 seconds. He's so good at that. He's so good at the traditional wall walk. It's just that game, when you sit up on your hands and you straighten your legs out to put your butt back, that's when Khabib sits on your ankles and does all that wrist riding stuff. Michael Chandler, not god tier at it. Khabib Nurmagomedov, god tier at it. So yeah, not gonna work too well against him. But as with everything, styles make fights. If you just want to hold someone down in close guard or half guard and elbow them, and they can wall walk like that, you're going to have a very hard time. So on the subject of straight shooting, Dustin Poirier has this left straight which was chewing Chandler up. And it's really quite interesting because it's... we talked about leaning on punches and how Chandler overcommits and stuff, but this left straight is really interesting because it's basically an arm punch. He leans forward at the waist and snaps his arm out, from coiled bicep curl position to straight. And it's kind of an arm punch, but it keeps landing, and he's so good at it. And we talked about this. He's got a couple of variations of it. He'll do it going forwards, but he also does one which he caught Eddie Alvarez with 3 or 4 times over their couple of matches. And I talked about it in the Advanced Striking article. But he'll pump his left straight out as he steps his left foot back, and he'll catch guys coming in like that. It's really interesting, like a retreating left straight. And it's an arm punch, but if you hit someone in the jaw with your strong hand as an arm punch as they're stepping in, you can really rock their shit up. So all of that being said, that flow of the fight. Chandler hurts him early. Poirier goes to the fence. Dustin Poirier along the fence, it can be bad. Sometimes he's really good, and he'll cover with high elbows and he'll come back with a hook. And he hurt McGregor like that in their second fight, I think it was. Other times he's looking for uppercuts and stuff and just missing. He was swinging with his arms by his waist on the first one of these, and I was going, oh my God, he's going to get knocked out. But his fight with Max Holloway, the second one, is really interesting because both of them have this thing where they hurt people, the opponent goes back to the fence, and then they just run in swinging and get clipped with a counterpunch. And both of them did it in their second fight. But Chandler did it here. At the end of the first round, he just got dropped with a great right hook off the high elbows, covering up along the fence. And he basically, for a lot of people, he stole the round from Chandler because Chandler had been doing good work in terms of getting his punches. He was throwing a lot of punches and missing a lot of punches. But he landed a couple of big ones, stunned Poirier, got a takedown. Man, there was a guy years and years ago, before I even started writing about MMA, who I can't remember what his name was, but he was this big, beardy gay dude, Queen of the Bears style dude. He had a YouTube channel, and he was talking about... I came across this clip about him talking about Arlovsky years and years ago. And he said, Andrei Arlovsky fights like the angriest girl you've ever seen. He's on top of you, pulling your hair, hammer fisting you, raking your eyes. And Michael Chandler did fight like the angriest girl you've ever seen in this fight. He cheated his arse off. Hit in the back of the head, fish hooked him. I mean, I was watching him try and fish hook him, and then Dustin Poirier is talking to the referee, and then it's always interesting when they do the like, oh, I respect you, blah blah blah, after the match, and then the commentator comes in, the interviewer comes in and goes, so he was cheating his ass off. What do you have to say about that? Which is what happened to this one. Dustin Poirier had been like, nothing but respect for you, baby, to Chandler in the. After the hand raised by the ref bit. Then Joe Rogan comes in and says, you were talking to the ref there. And Dustin Poirier goes, yeah, he was fish hooking me, the motherfucker. But then the other one was like, Poirier throws up the triangle in the second round, and a huge amount of blood just explodes into Poirier's eyes. And the commentary team were like, oh my God, he cut him open with an elbow. No, he didn't. Chandler blew his nose into his eyes. Go and watch that again. It's absolutely rank. There's a reason there were like clots in it. It's because it's from his fucking nose. And Chandler, like, it's amazing. The toughest people in the UFC. I mean, Dustin Poirier is one of the toughest sons of a gun in MMA. You blow blood into his eyes, and he gives up the triangle and rolls over his shoulder. And I think he basically gave up his back. But yeah, it's crazy how well that worked. There was a moment along the fence actually when Dustin Poirier was in closed guard. Chandler was in his closed guard, and Dustin Poirier sat up on an elbow, and Chandler managed to catch it underneath him, the Gary Goodridge style position. I mean, it's basically the Dagestani handcuff, but it used to happen from closed guard. And it's such a scary, powerful position, because it's very hard to get your hand back if your hand's stuck underneath your body weight. And you don't see a lot of guys getting knocked out there. You never have. But when guys get stuck there, they can get hit really hard, because you've lost everything down one side of your body to stop strikes coming in. I mean, that's why the Dagestani handcuffs are so good anyway, but Gary Goodridge used to knock people out from there, and Chris Hordecki, he was a really hot prospect in the IFL, and then one day he just, like, some guy just caught his hand behind his back from half guard, and Hordecki couldn't do anything, just got pounded out. I thought it was quite interesting that Chandler, sorry, I'm all over the place with this discussion, but I thought it was quite interesting that Chandler went to body kicks early in the first round, because one of the things about Poirier's guard, I mean, just take a look at the picture that I did of his stance for the studies. I always do like a picture of their stance from two sides as like the top image of the study. And Poirier does like a shoulder roll, but with his elbow very high. Everything is up around his head, protecting his head. In boxing, if you watch someone like Mayweather, their lead hand is bent across their belly, basically. So they're taken away almost, like, even like the jab to the solar plexus is somewhat limited by that. You're trying to cover as much as possible. In MMA, and particularly Dustin Poirier himself, it's good to limit. Everyone's aiming for your head all the time, so it's good to just double down on that. Also, you see Poirier against Hooker. He was using his elbow to back elbow Hooker's jabs out of the way. But it means that his body's undefended a lot of the time. So, even good for strikers like Dan Hooker, who loves hitting the body most of the time, he got carried away trying to hit him in the head and got into this war with him. Well, Chandler actually landed a good few body kicks. And then he threw an inside low kick, and Poirier just took it shin on shin and laughed at him. And the kick stopped coming after that. He just seemed like he hurt his foot on it. But the end was wild. Chandler had been reaching for this high crotch or like a snatch single throughout the fight, and he'd been using it to sort of like set up coming upstairs with punches, and then he only really committed to like a big takedown attempt when they were close to the fence, which I thought was pretty good. I mean, obviously it goes down on the stats as Poirier defended a takedown, but it's more important to get him defending the takedown so that you can hit him with punches. There are takedowns and there are takedowns, because like there isn't a divider in the statistics between good faith takedowns and half-assed fake takedowns. If you want 100% takedown accuracy, you have to go hard as hell and give yourself a hernia on every shot you take. Whereas if you don't care about having like 70% takedown accuracy as long as you get the takedowns, you can fake takedowns and half-assedly slap at their legs and they'll throw themselves into a sprawl. I always think of Sean Brady versus Jake McKenzie. He did a little fake towards McKenzie's legs. McKenzie throws himself into a sprawl and Brady just grabs the front headlock. I mean, it happens all the time in wrestling, but it's rarer to see it in MMA. Or, of course, Chad Mendes against Jose Aldo. Fakes the shot, loads up his right hand. Guess who's going to jail? But yeah, third round, Chandler comes out and really commits to a takedown out in the open. Hoists Poirier above the ring. Like, sometimes Chandler gets tired. It's no secret that he gets tired. He always has. It's not something new about him. You watch like the last couple of rounds of his fight with Primus the second time. Because he lost the premise by leg injury, by calf kick, and people were like, fluke, he'll blow him out of the water next time. They did the rematch, and, Chandler won, but he didn't blow him out of the water at all. He won by decision. And a lot of it was just holding Primus down in closed guard along the fence because Chandler gets tired. But he gets tired and he still tries to do big things because he is, in the UFC, he has recognized that he's not the best fighter, so he will be an action fighter. And obviously, we all love him for it, but it does mean that he's absolutely gassed, and then he hoists Poirier up above him and slams him down, runs towards his back and falls off and ends up on the bottom. And the moment that he hit the bottom and Poirier came up into half guard and started dropping elbows, you could see that he was basically done. He was out of energy. He was giving up, and Poirier got on his back and easily choked him. So what's next for either? Dustin Poirier probably does another fun fight, maybe Gaethje again, because Gaethje's sort of directionless in his career. Unless they fucking try and book Makhachev, or actually a winner of Makhachev-Volkanovski, I suppose, which would just be bizarre. Actually, if Volkanovski wins, fuck it, give him Dustin Poirier. But really, they're just doing their separate division where they're not they don't want to fight Gamrot or Dariush or anyone like that. For Chandler, I suspect he's going to get a title shot off this, or at least campaign for one. Yeah, I mean, Michael Chandler in the ring, great fun. Michael Chandler, any time between the end of his last fight and the start of his next fight, unbearable. Co-main event was a lot of people saw it as a foregone conclusion. Carla Esparza versus Zhang Weili. Pretty interesting. I mean, Carla Esparza's striking, she kept doing this cover up, roll, and then shift through on a weird left hook. You're going, why? If you're coaching Carla Esparza, if you're coaching anyone in women's MMA, just teach them to throw a hard 1-2. Because if you can throw a good right hand, you are better than 90% of women's fighters who've ever competed in the UFC. You have a game-breaking cheat code that you're using by having power. Don't believe me? Amanda Nunes. There you go. But aside from the horrible striking, takedowns were pretty good. She got a high crotch into a crackdown in the first round, and it was interesting. It's an interesting playoff because we talk about the crackdown quite a lot. It's been a big part of a couple of fighters' games, and they've been sort of unathletic grapplers. Jake Shields is an important one, and Haniyaya. Enrique Barzola was doing some of it the other week, but he'd seen it, or he'd had it done to him by Haniyaya. Shields versus Henderson would be a really good example, because Dan Henderson's super explosive, super experienced wrestler, and also bigger than Jake Shields, and also had rocked Jake Shields, and Jake Shields was still able to slowly pull him down into the crackdown and make it into this weird fight where neither man is really in an athletic position. To briefly talk about what the crackdown is you shoot a single with your head on the outside or a high crotch, and instead of trying to run through on a double or do one of the athletic finishes, you pull the guy down so that he's sitting on his hip and your arm's still inside his leg. Now, the weird thing about it is that it's also, you're a little bit squirming away from being in a crucifix in jiu-jitsu. So you're turning it into this very low amplitude but high stakes scramble. And in the first round, Carla Esparza turned into Weili, so she was looking up at the ceiling in sort of a crucifix, but she threw her arm over Weili's head into a headlock and freed the arm that was between Weili's legs and turned into her and got on top. When the fight ended, that was because she got the crackdown, she ended up in the same position, couldn't free her arm in time. Weili controlled the hand that she threw over the head for a headlock to pull her arm out with, and stuck the hand under the throat and got a crucifix short choke, which you very rarely see in MMA, but very cool nonetheless, and real interesting because it was a sequence that played out twice, and you could see what Weili was trying to do the first time, and then the second time she got it. A sad loss for the crackdown, because I do love the crackdown, but really interesting from Zhang Weili, whose grappling just seems to be getting better and better, whose wrestling seems to be getting better and better, and whose striking actually seems to be getting better and better, because all she used to have was an inside low kick. It's amazing what fighting not bums has done for her, because she was stagnant for 11 fights, and then she started fighting good people and started getting better. What's next there? Who cares? Erin Blanchfield, maybe. That was the other women's strawweight fight on this card. Oh no, it was flyweight. Sorry, Molly McCann versus Erin Blanchfield. Blanchfield, people have been saying that she's hot shit for a while. Didn't take a punch in this fight. Like, took McCann down easily, mogged on her from side control, kept stepping over for the crucifix, not really doing any damage. But the crucifix, like, very seldom is actually a damaging position. It's more the technicality that if you cannot intelligently defend yourself by the words of the rule to the letter, the referee has to stop the fight. Unless you're Kimbo Slice and you just keep giving the ref the thumbs up as you're held down for a whole round and pounded in the head. But she finished with Kimura. It was really nice. Yeah. They got tired of paying Molly McCann's hotel bill or whatever it was. Yeah, always exciting to have someone new coming up. Unfortunately at flyweight, not at strawweight, which is actually an exciting division. What else was happening? Chris Gutierrez, murked Frankie Edgar. Edgar didn't get a single thing going. Again, I've talked about this before, but I'm so annoyed by the way they did this, because you could have got a great Fight Night main event at some arena out of Frankie Edgar versus Dominic Cruz. People would buy that because people recognize that neither man is what he used to be, but people have always been interested in hell by that matchup. If you are ever in doubt about this, Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. was one of the most talked about fights whenever it happened. Was that 2020? Was that 2020 or 2021? But it happened the other year, and it was huge. I mean, only for a few days, because that's how things go in the modern news cycle, but that was a fight where everyone knew both were old men, but they still got excited as hell by it. And I, as a guy who was like, I don't want to see either of these guys fight anymore, was still really excited by the fight and actually quite impressed. If you did Dom Cruz versus Frankie Edgar, I think people would be, MMA fans would be pretty much the same as that. They'd love to see that. But that ain't how the UFC rolls. We get Chris Gutierrez the knockout of the year. Don't give him a bonus. He gains very little from this, because everyone who knows Frankie Edgar knows this ain't it. Just, very silly and kind of cruel. I mean, obviously Frankie accepted the fight. He thought he could win it, but you could have done something big, and instead you did something, he went off like a fart in church. Dan Hooker versus Claudio apparently is Poirier, not Pules. But this was Nick Serra refusing to come out of the butt scoot levels of not great. Claudio Poirier, great entering on legs. Turns out not very comfortable anywhere else. And here's the thing. You've got to have the confidence to go after it. Fabricio Verdum was, for a long time, confused with being a good striker. He wasn't. He had a 1-2 and a round kick. But he threw them confidently. And that allowed him to do other stuff. There was no reason that Poirier couldn't have gone out and at least tried to chin Dan Hooker. Maybe won a little bit of respect from him. But he didn't. He rolled for legs. He did get close on a leg there. He was playing on the outside Ashy for a little while. Started attacking the knee bar, started attacking the heel hook. Started on the heel hook grip, but then Hooker was keeping his leg straight, so he started hipping into the leg. It's one of those positions where, like, he didn't get the submission, but it didn't look like it was fun for Hooker. And I think he was limping a little bit after the fight. If you train with heel hooks at all, and you're doing any sort of like resistance training, I know a lot of gyms are still very catch and release on heel hooks, but a lot of gyms now, especially if you know your training partners and you're all of a decently high level, you fuck around with heel hooks. You don't crank them on, but you play around with where you can get to in them. The other guy has to, because in tournaments and so on, people are now escaping from heel hooks. It's not you catch it and that's the end of the match. So if you ever do a few rolls or a roll where you fight off a heel hook for a bit, you might never feel like you were close to tapping, but later in the day you'll be like, ow, my leg. So it can't have been fun for him. But Poirier got close on the Imanari roll, doing it straight off the bat, and then just kept doing it. Went for a couple of takedowns and just like fell down the guy's leg, fell down Hooker's leg and gave up on them. And looked pretty much broken mentally, whereas Hooker was just, doing his job. And Dan Hooker's another one. Like, Dustin Poirier, we were all like, oh, he has crap jiu-jitsu because he lost to the best submission artist in MMA and the best cage wrestler in MMA. But Dan Hooker, people were like, oh, he's trash or whatever. Lost to Arnold Allen when he cut a ton of weight and diminished his chin. But, he hadn't won one in a while, and he beat Nasrat Haqparast. But people still hate him for beating Paul Felder. And he is very good, and people don't seem to see it a lot of the time because of who he's fighting. But it was interesting because he does that thing where If you would have looked at his hands, both his fists were pointing right at Poirier the entire time, which makes feinting... Firstly, it makes it hitting a lot faster. You lose a little bit of that having those straight forearms up ready to absorb kicks, but Poirier wasn't kicking. And if you have your hands pointing at the guy, you can throw your punches and get them to the target faster. It's a little bit harder for him to read. And also, when you feint, he then reacts more. Dan often has his rear hand pointed at the opponent and way out in front of his chest, ready to punch. So he was faking him out plenty, and Poirier was like diving to his back and stuff. And then you just hit him with a couple of good, long, straight front snap kicks, which we keep saying are the best weapon in MMA, but they really are. I think that's part of why Sean O'Malley is such a tricky fighter. He's only really got a couple of counters and these great front snap kicks that he uses to change stance, and he can circle off well. But they really do just break people. Especially experienced fighters who are like, I probably know how things feel, and then you eat a good front kick to the body, and you go, oh no, I'm not used to this. What else? I mean, we were all expecting Riddell versus Moicano to be a banger. Moicano's a weird one, man, because sometimes he comes out and just looks absolutely petrified on the feet, and other times he comes out against Riddell, who's very, very scary on the feet. Went even with Fiziev over 2 rounds or whatever it was before he got finished. Yeah, really bad dude on the feet. And Moicano just jabbed him up. Then got him down and rear naked choked him easily. Moicano is like this. He's the definition of a hit and miss fighter. New ink, though, pretty good. Pretty solid. I like the clean lines on it. Yeah, it's a frustrating thing being a Moicano fan. But, you got a good chance of a good fight out of him, regardless. Is he on a 2-fight win streak now? Oh, no, he lost to Dos Anjos just before that. Yeah, God, crazy. Yes, this is it. It's just... the hit and missest man alive. Though I wouldn't even call 2 fights a streak, to be honest, because they were saying the streaking Ryan Spann when they were talking about that fight, and the streak was 1 win over Ion Cutelaba and then 1 loss to Anthony Smith. I mean, we should touch on that fight. It was fucking miserable. Dominic Reyes, just a precipitous drop-off. Just very sad, because he was robbed of a probably deserved win against John Jones. Even if you don't think he won, he still took the best fighter in his division to a very close decision. And then he'd suffered a brutal knockout against Blachowicz and then one against Jiri. It's been a huge amount of time between each fight. So it should be the case that... Because we're always saying, I want fighters to take more time off if they can afford to after suffering a bad knockout. But he's taken a lot of time off, and it seems like it's just not helping him at all. This one, he was just lunging face first onto punches. You beat Chris Weidman, and then you've become Chris Weidman. Needs to hang it up. And also, God, literally worst comb over in combat sports. Bobby Charlton-esque. But mainly just sad, man. What else was good? Frivola knocked out Otman Azaita, who just, they were saying he looked off, but he did look bizarre. Because I've seen him fight before, and I've seen him knock people out before, but I was watching him going, does he always do this? He just looked so wooden the entire time. Maybe he looked a bit more muscular than the last time I saw him, but he just looked like unreacting to everything that Frivola did. Frivola, he tried to pressure in on Frivola, and then Frivola hit him with a couple of right hands and a left hook and knocked him down and out. It was really weird, because a lot of people, myself included, thought Frivola was probably being set up to lose here on the way out of the UFC, but man, didn't expect Azaita to be so easy for him. Kowalkiewicz versus Gomez Juarez was not an interesting fight. Kowalkiewicz is still closing her eyes when she throws her punches and throwing both hands forward at the same time. But she did get the win, which is always nice, because she had some really bad mental health stuff she was quite open about with her 4-fight losing streak. But the only really interesting thing about this fight was the man from the commission running in to change the scores on camera while they were in Bruce Buffer's hands. He literally put them up on the cage, on the top of the cage, as a clipboard or a thing to write on, and started changing the numbers. And nobody knew who this fucking dude was. He wasn't. He could have been one of the judges. He probably wasn't one of the judges. And it was just insane. You're watching it in real time, going, "What?" If that's how easy it is to change the result of a fight and then be like, "No, nothing untoward happened," they should just do it all the time. But then I presume the only people who were betting on this fight were actual degenerates and people who were, I don't know, trying to work a fix and get a huge amount of money, because nobody's going to be betting on this fucking fight. Trezano knocked out Hong Woo Choi. That was just funny for the... Neither man could deal with the other's left hook, so they kept having to try and get to their left hook first. Reminded me of Ramon Dekkers versus... Fuck, I can't remember who it was. But he had a very famous double knockdown by left hook. It happened exactly the same way. They both traded like 1, 2, 3 twice, each of them getting the better on the hook on one of the exchanges. And then on the third one, they just hit the same timing and knocked each other down. Montel Jackson versus Julio Arce was a big nothing fight. Julio Arce just loves not doing enough, and Montel Jackson was happy to meet him in that. And then Carlos Ulberg did his same thing again. I mean, he knocked out Nchukwi by jabbing until Nchukwi was reaching like Sean Strickland with his right hand way out in front of him like Frankenstein's monster or a zombie. And then he threw a left hook instead and caught him on the jaw, flush. And this one, he threw the jab, leaned back and hit him with a left hook as he ran forward, pumping his right hand. Really, yeah, good for him. He's found a trick, and he's found that every light heavyweight is a doofus with their right hand. Give this man Sean Strickland. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. We got some bizarre fights coming up at the weekend. We've got some boxing to talk about, actually, including a Floyd Mayweather exhibition, which I will not be touching. But yeah, we've got some fun stuff coming up next weekend with Bellator. Corey Anderson gets his rematch with Vadim Nemkov. He was battering Nemkov, and then a headbutt opened a cut and stopped the fight. Everyone was surprised he was battering Nemkov. He looked the best he'd ever looked. So I fully expect him to lose this one and then never get the respect he was due. But we're going to be talking about that on the Boycast. There's a UFC event which is largely Drek, but my boy Jack Della Maddalena's on it, and there's a couple of others. And then of course, if you are at a loss for things to do, go and read some advanced striking studies. If you want to read those studies, support the podcast and listen to all the Boycasts and so on, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I am your boy, Jack Slack. 4 left hook knockouts in one night, a year after I said the left hook is the next technique that's going to blow up in MMA. Bless.